We Love Decentralized is a new interview series with the artist Vesa, whose pioneering works have changed the world, reach hundreds of millions of people, and embraces an integral, constructive, and forward-thinking view. We believe that embracing creativity in multiple sectors is a must, not a maybe. This series is about breaking rules, defying expectation, and having the courage to move with a fast pace of our collective evolution. The overarching intention is to build bridges between people and fields that don't commonly talk to one another. Feel free to check out the art platform, artforcrypto.com. Now here's our host, artist Vesa.
Welcome to We Love Decentralized. And this is a conversation between me and Jenny Knott. And she's a board-level investment banker with over 30 years experience, as well as a leading innovator in financial technologies. She was the CEO of an international investment bank and a global capital markets infrastructure business with a large portfolio of fintechs. And she's the founder of FinTech Strategic Advisors, and quite an awesome human being, as well as all of her accomplishments. And she showed a lot of courage, of course, coming to talk with an artist like myself about creativity and all things life. And some of the topics that we covered in this conversation were diversity, female survival tactics in a male testosterone-driven finance world, the essential need for creativity and how she thinks about things like that, and when especially recruiting people and going into her own background in things, and postmodernism versus the future, which came a little bit as a topic from me first, and she dwells into that as well, and from the art perspective. And a lot of these topics seem to come back to the loss in institutional trust in societies and globally, I suppose. And that was a running theme that we tried to put some light into, and finance disruption, of course, via blockchain, and the unbanked world, and the need for financial services to evolve. The youth and evolution of our coming future was a topic towards the end, as well as one of my favorites, blockchain for good. And I hope you join me in welcoming Jenny to this conversation, and I hope you get something out of it, because I certainly did, and I thank her very much for this session that we did together. Welcome to We Love Decentralized.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and we met at Erica's Crypto Curry Club. You were there as a keynote speaker, and I was flabbergasted by your energy,
Thank you.
your credibility, and which leads me to the first question, because there's someone who I admire quite a bit in the blockchain space, Maxine Ryan. She's the CEO of BitSpark, and she's female, and she's from Hong Kong, and half, I think, Chinese and half Australian, I think it was. And she'd have all the different kinds of sort of modern excuses to use the female card or the minority card or that kind of thing. And last time I had an hour-long conversation with her, she hasn't utilized any of it, and she wouldn't even see the world that way unless if someone reminded her of it. And this was what made the biggest impression on me, because you have done this way before it was cool, and you must have had some interesting battles, and you refused to use the female card, and that was very inspiring to me. And that's the first thing that I really want to know about, how you've managed to do all of this.
Well, in a funny way, I think possibly. So actually, I'm also the chairman or the chair of a diversity business. A business that's about breaking down the barriers in diversity and inclusivity. And so when we talk about diversity, we talk about three lenses. And the first lens is demographic. So, you know, your gender, your sexual preference, your religious background, the colour of your skin. And those are kind of things that you're born. So I can't help that I was born female.
Yeah, sure.
And I don't really want it to define me, the fact that I'm female. So the demographic factors are the ones that we measure and monitor because we can measure them, but they're not really telling us about diversity. So they don't tell you an awful lot, and they're not particularly helpful when you're looking for what I would consider to be a really comprehensively diverse leadership team in an organisation, which is this particular business that I'm the chair for, EQUIIDA. And the other two lenses are far more important when you're trying to develop that sort of really broad skill set. And those two lenses are cognitive diversity and experiential. And cognitive diversity is about what matters. It's about your values. So having a leadership team with people who all have similar cognitive backgrounds, what matters to them is the same, how they think is the same, is not particularly interesting. You're not going to get, great debate, different challenging thinking, people operating in different styles, because they're cognitively the same. And similarly with the third lens, experiential, if everybody has been born of the same social class, in the same geography, had the same kind of educational backgrounds and career experiences and life experiences, they're also thinking in a very similar way. So if you want to survive this world that we're in, you need a truly diverse leadership team, and therefore you need people who have very different experiences in their life, whether that's because they speak more than one language, or they've come from a different geography, or they've come from a different socioeconomic background, or what matters to them is completely different from you. Or they grew up, they're 25 years old and they've grown up in an era where technology is in the palm of their hands and they're used to everything here and now and being available here and now. So if you're a commercial business, a retail business, how many retail boards have a 25-year-old on their board? But they ought to, and they ought to have a 25-year-old in a leadership position, because that 25-year-old is completely used to using digital money to buy their digital needs in the palm of their hands here and now. So if you're trying to build a business or survive, you really want people who think completely differently from you to give you that diversity of thought and experience. So a classic mantra of mine in the day was think differently to do differently. If you don't think differently, you're not going to do differently. So going back to your question, it's less about my demographic diversity and my career success. I think was more about my cognitive and experiential diversity. So I grew up in global investment banking, where traditionally most people were socioeconomically from a very different background. I'm sort of at best lower middle class by demographic factors. I grew up in southeast London. I went to a comprehensive school. I didn't really like university, ran away, got a job and in a bank for a few months to sort of then go travelling and possibly go back and do a different type of degree. And most of my peers in the investment bank at that time were Oxbridge, were very well-to-do, and came from a very different background. But that also meant that I was the different one. I was the outsider. I was the one who thought differently, had different experiences, was prepared to work harder because it meant more to me, because from whence I came was not where I wanted to go back to, and where they perhaps were a bit more complacent about the advantages they had in life, what had been invested in them, they took for granted, where I saw their opportunities and their platform as something aspirational. They were complacent. But similarly, when it came to decision making, if you've grown up in a tougher environment, you have to make decisions, and they're a bit more survival-based decisions. And so being a risk taker and a decision maker was natural in my DNA. And I think that also made me different from my peer group. And that decision making capability, I'm prepared to be a risk taker and a decision maker. I'm prepared. In lots of big institutions, you find a lot of people don't really want to be the one that's held to account. They'd much rather be what we call Teflon. It's just remove me from the risk of the decision. Where I kind of like, okay, well, I've made a decision. I've weighed up all the pros and cons. I've looked at all the signs and the evidence of the fact pattern. I believe this is the way we're going to go. I've taken all the input. I've listened to my peers and the people around me, and this is the decision. And that risk-taking, that decision-making, I think was really important. The fact that I was different from most of my peers, maybe because of my gender, maybe because of my background, whatever, all those sort of cognitive and experiential factors, meant that my input came from a different lens and actually was challenging to their input. Mm-hmm. So an example I use is Wall Street. Lehman's back in the day scored the highest on diversity. So on those things we can measure, so the number of senior women, the number of people from an ethnic minority, all those sort of measurable factors, Lehman scored the highest. But from a cognitive perspective, the culture of Lehman's was not a challenging culture. So if you disagreed with a decision, it wasn't acceptable to share that disagreement. And it's no surprise that Lehman's didn't surprise when everybody is forced to think in the same way and behave in the same way. You're not allowed to challenge the status quo. You're not allowed to challenge what you would perceive as a bad decision. So the fact that I operate in environments where that challenge was embraced was a platform that suited me. I was able to challenge, able to think differently, and that was rewarded in my career. Does that make sense?
Right, absolutely. I just maybe this is a little bit controversial, but to challenge that just a little bit, it does seem to me that a lot of this diversity is also used as a bit of a weapon to silence people right now. There's a lot of diversity, but all of a sudden there's not as much diversity of ideas, or those even discussing those different ideas has become a little bit of a contention point. And I never really cared. I come from a background where my mother was an air hostess, so I got to travel quite a bit. And it never made sense to me. I had very strong women in my family.
So I come from a matriarchal household as well. So
right. Well, we sort of had both. There was an interesting mixture of things, but I had respect for both, sort of naturally. Yeah. And
but that's the critical success factor, is that diversity is irrelevant if you don't have inclusivity. So what you're saying is you had respect and you listened to both sides, that you had input from lots of different perspectives. And I think the inclusivity part of diversity is the super success factor. So you can have lots of opinions, but if people don't listen to them, they're just there for lip service, to tick a box, to look good, which is the Lehman's diversity model. And then it doesn't mean anything, diversity. So diversity is, there are lots of great books that have been written in recent years about diversity. And one of my favourite author, I can't remember, but I'm sure your readers and listeners will, but is about why I don't talk to white people about colour anymore. And it's a brilliant book, because how can I possibly pretend to understand what it's like to grow up as a young black man in South East London? I grew up as a young white woman in South East London 50 years ago. So it's a very different series of life experiences that I was exposed to. So I can't possibly say, and I completely agree with the sort of ethos that, it's incredibly insulting to say, I don't see colour. It's a stupid thing to say. It's incredibly insulting to put my life experiences on a parallel with somebody else's and say, well, they're the same. I understand where you're coming from. No, I don't. I have no idea what it's like to be stopped in the street because of the colour of my skin. And I can't imagine the horror and the embarrassment of such an experience. So, the political correctness and the politicization of diversity is not helpful, because we use it as a carrot and a stick, but we don't really mean anything by it unless we involve people in the decision making and make them feel part of, included in the future of whatever we're trying to solve for.
But I suppose that was the beginning premise of what I was trying to come at, is that you can't really remove individual choice. Some people take the low road and some people take the high road. And it in some way, regardless of your background or whatever it is, there's a certain amount of character that determines your fate. And even many people who come from absolutely nothing can make it to the top. And then some people who have it all.
But that's experiential, isn't it? I mean, I can look at people I went to school with and have the same socioeconomic background, the same key factors, demographic factors as me, and they chose a completely different path. that's humans for you.
Sure. Yeah.
So
no, but that was the thing. My whole thing was what I saw in you was someone who took the high road and fought for the respect of getting into the position where you are at.
Like, I didn't plan it, right? So that's, I'm always very honest about that. I mean, the world that I operate in today, I wouldn't have even been able to spell at 18. I didn't know my world existed. I wouldn't have been able to define the term CEO when I was 18 years old, because I had never met a CEO and it wasn't something in my vocabulary, and I never aspired to be. I probably at 17 didn't even really know what the term global investment banking meant. So, those things were unknown. So I didn't feel like a second-class citizen because I didn't know I was a second-class citizen.
Right. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
So I never fought for anything. I wasn't sort of, and I do think that's a bit generational. Like, I think children today have much more exposure to what they can't have. I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't have 30 years ago.
Sure. So if there was, I'm sure there were many occasions where someone perhaps tried to paint you in a corner and sort of, because I'm sure you've been in situations where there's a lot of testosterone, a lot of competition, and it gets pretty cutthroat with money, with people. So did you have some sort of, did you develop some tactics or default things by the way in how to sort of deal with situations like that?
I did, and those skills I think are life skills. I still use those skills today. So I've always said, and particularly as a woman, don't talk too much. Don't dominate the conversation in the airwaves, because we are classically accused of talking too much. Don't talk too loudly. Don't have a high-pitched voice. Women, when they get overexcited and emotional, which in a man is passionate, but in a woman is, hysteria, our voices tend to go up. So I deliberately have worked quite hard at keeping the pitch and the tone of my voice lower rather than higher.
Alpha range.
Exactly. And then a very important one is, just say it succinctly. Less is more. So you don't need to justify being in the room. You don't need to justify your point and explain every aspect of rationale behind the decision that you've made. You can just own that. So, sure. Not over dominating the conversation and your position in it, not trying to over explain the drivers behind it is also very important. You can own these things. You don't have to expand too much. And you often see women over expanding. So when I'm communicating in a boardroom, predominantly most of the people at the table will be male. Predominantly, they won't give me visual clues that they're listening and acknowledging what I'm saying. So if I'm talking to a female audience will really be quite demonstrative about the fact they're following the conversation. Your classic, sort of white male, pale, 60 plus boardroom audience will just be there. And because I'm not getting those verbal cues back, I'm not, in my early career, I would think they're not listening to me, they're not acknowledging, they're not understanding. There's no big gestures of, I get it, I'm with you, I'm following you, I'm on your wavelength, and yes, I understand. And so, you can repeat until you get that visual cue, but all you're going to get is someone looking really bored now because you said the same thing 3 times, just using different words. Right. So learning those, that people communicate differently between generation and between gender is actually very important as well.
Well, that actually leads very naturally to one of the main points of why I wanted to have this conversation, which is creativity. And the way that I define creativity, just a little bit of a backstory, is that I saw, of course, I suffered through the normal education system like most people do, and as a creative and someone, like for example, if I have a phone conversation when I'm at home, I walk back and forth like aimlessly in the room because the walking and the motion helps me think. So you can imagine what kind of a nightmare the boring books and the school setting was for me. It just simply didn't work for not only the non-motion, but at the same time, all the material that we were studying of just how uninspiring the whole way of how it was taught was for me. And I rebelled against it to a relative degree, but I also wanted to do well. So I kept at it and went through eventually to film school and through university and things like that. But then I saw this TED Talk by this guy called Sir Ken Robinson, and it's one of the most successful TED Talks of all time. And he essentially explains as to how the Industrial Revolution brought about the value system of the education system that in 200 years all over the world hasn't changed much. So the way that I see, most people don't identify themselves as being creative, but most people actually use creativity on the day-to-day basis all the time. And the way that I define it is putting two different things together that haven't been put together like that, or somehow figuring things out in your mind and then manifesting them into reality in a new, refreshing, interesting kind of way. So I'm sure you do that a bunch. Do you think you're a creative person?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because you know, as parents, we have this debate about our children's success and which one of us is responsible for it.
Right.
And well, actually, probably my husband doesn't, but I do. I try and claim all the credit for every success that our children have, and it's so just to roll back a little bit to agree with the points that you made and give a slightly different perspective. So, I'm really saddened by the English school system's a sort of lack of appreciation for the creative subjects. So, you know, to me, when I'm recruiting, when I'm looking for quality talent to come into my organisation, and historically I've always felt really passionately about this, so many people will have a CV presented that, you know, frankly, they ought to have done well, right? They've been given these incredible opportunities to have so much invested, you know, they haven't had to worry about food and shelter, for example, and they haven't had to worry about a safe place to study and a book and resources to study with. They've been given these, you know, even if it's our state school system in England, but certainly our public school system and private education, the fact that you've had small classes with high quality teachers, and you've been able to, you know, be funded through your tertiary education. I expect people on a CV to have done well in their A-levels and done well in their degree results because they've been incredibly invested in it. Even if it's different degrees, even between, you know, my comprehensive school education and let's say my children's private school education, which I, you know, could only have dreamed of when I was their age, they've still been incredibly invested in vis-a-vis someone, you know, coming from a different geography, a third world country, where books are shared, where there's one teacher for the school, not a teacher per subject per year per etc. etc. So, you know, when I look at someone's CV and I see they've got A's and A stars and 1s and 2s and everything else that we measure, it's kind of like, so what? You know, what I want to know is, did you choose to study something that was you know, I want to see, you know, photographic A-level, I want to see art A-level, I want to see somebody, because in my real world, it's all about thinking forward, solving forward, preempting everything and making bold decisions and being creative and being lateral. So even before D&I was diversity and inclusivity were sort of terms that were used, what really mattered to me, my leadership teams, were people who thought differently, who could bring a different perspective to the same fact pattern, a different insight that were challenging. And, you know, it's a bit of a sort of running joke, but some of my leadership meetings, you know, you need to take paracetamol because there was so much debate and challenge. But that's really critical because that means that those people are challenging one another. They're listening, they're debating, they're thinking differently. So if they haven't studied a creative subject, they're not showing me at 25 years old that they have the ability to be creative and think differently, because we're all about problem solving. We're solving for problems we didn't even know existed or we don't know yet exist. So the ability to be lateral in the way that you think and be creative in the way you think is absolutely critical. And our school system doesn't value those subjects in the same way as they value the sort of, you know, more traditional subjects. And I think that's a really sad thing that we are not embracing creativity in our academic agenda the way we ought to, because that's the skill that differentiates my leaders from everybody else.
And probably the ability to take pressure as well.
Cope with pressure, but also, you know, when you're talking about what are the X factors in winning teams and winning organisation, winning companies, it is the creativity. It is absolutely creativity. It's the problem-solving creativity. It's the lateral thinking and what I call thinking forward, you know, trying to think about what matters next, what our clients are going to need next, what's happening in this sort of, you know, our world, Western Caucasian world, is classically defined as, through this sort of analysis they've done with students, where American students look at a picture of a tiger in a jungle, and American students look at the tiger. They don't really look at the jungle.
Yeah.
And then Asian students look at the jungle because they can see the tiger and they disregard it. But American students focus on the tiger for longer. And what that's telling you is that Asian students generally can cope with more stimulus around, whereas traditional education systems, you focus on the obvious and you look at that and you're looking at the shape and the size of the tiger or whatever it was, rather than all the stimuli. And so when you go to places like Hong Kong or Tokyo, you sort of, all these lights are buzzing and they're taking all of that stimuli in and processing it, and that's really important because that's this new digital world of ours. Is a lot of information. It's no longer just going to a reference library and looking up a book. It is a world. You put a question into Google, you're going to get 1 trillion different things to read about, and being able to cope with that multiple stimuli is really important. And extract. That is, for me, a creative process, and children need to be armed with that skill.
Well, there's not only the education system as in one way is a challenge, and bear with me with this question because it's also kind of a point that I struggle with quite a bit, because about 100 years ago, when the deconstruction movement in the art world started, and maybe most famously someone like the Picasso's and Dali's work and the absurd and everything, and then the whole postmodern movement essentially started being very, very much about analyzing power, and then becoming more and more molecular in their deconstruction of everything. And my inspiration came more from originally maybe someone like Dali and Picasso, and they immediately, when I saw their works, a new world had been birthed inside of my head. But as I grew, I didn't go forward, I went backward. I went to the time of Da Vinci and people like that. When Da Vinci in his time, he wasn't only making art, he was figuring out anatomy and how to build cannons to defend Florence, and that's obviously not
flying
something
machines and everything else.
So, and the mystical realms and everything to the whole of the thing, and basically that's what I've been trying to do, not probably at his level, but in the modern version of it. And what I find most interesting about art, and I think why it's been printed to the ground kind of like the Bolivar, is that it's been it's no longer relevant to anyone's life. It doesn't attempt to construct, it doesn't attempt to inspire. Beauty is almost driven out of it. All the things that I think built over millennia, the whole reputation of the art, why it was awe, why it was when you see the Sistine Chapel ceiling, no one needs to be explained that there's something really important going on there. So essentially, I've found that those who are meant to be on my side, those who are meant to be helping me with something as incredibly difficult as making art to begin with, are now the biggest opposing force for me to try and do this. Henceforth, why I'm in the blockchain space, because here's where the worlds are constructed, and I get to be shotgun in this whole movement forward. And the way that I see it is that, maybe controversially in crypto, they see that fiat is going down and crypto is going up. I feel like the traditional art world has been run to the ground, and only where it can go now is up. And that whole thing of where I see it being now also influences a lot of people's creativity. They don't necessarily go to an art museum or even high-level galleries to find inspiration or the kind of mentality where you figure your life out, where
but and I agree. I wouldn't disagree with the word that you said, but I think there are an awful lot of other factors that are part of some of that transformation. So for example, generally, and it's always general points that we're making here, but the trend or themes that are coming through are the libertarian themes, the sort of anti-establishment and loss of trust in establishment. And so those themes, whether you're applying them to the financial world or and politics, or whether you're applying them to the art world, are the same things. You're rebelling against something that's very traditional, and rebelling against something that's very conformist and very dominating, and almost a little bit exclusive. There's with the fine arts, there's a sort of an exclusivity and a vocabulary that is excluding
Yeah.
in its exclusivity. And so, the rebelling against that, the libertarian rebelling against that, I think is a very fundamental theme for both the art world and also in the crypto world. Similarly, the loss of trust in the establishment is a common theme of both. And almost there's been it's quite interesting. I mean, there's almost been a stripping back, and if you look at interiors of homes, they're really, the trend now is really minimalist. Actually, probably
quite Scandinavian.
Exactly, right, from whence you came. So that, and which I think is quite sad, really. Like, everybody wants sort of grey and white and metal, and expressing your personality. Yeah, expressing your personality and use of colour is all not quite so cool anymore. But maybe that's a plateau for embracing a different lens, which is that glass construct that goes with the grey and the white and the minimalist is actually an embracing of nature rather than manufactured nature. So maybe it's just a sort of a segue into a new appreciation of what's natural rather than what's manufactured. If that makes any sense at all.
It does make sense. I suppose that it's going to be hard to pin down in some sort of a way that it's one thing or this thing. It's likely many things at once, but there is that general trend of having been in the fine art world for 10 years and trying to get things done. And then what a refreshing movement it was for me to come to the blockchain space, where all of a sudden people hadn't been educated out of their senses. So the things that made sense to me, that I was like, look at this. In the art world, they go like, ugh. And then normal people or the blockchain world went, this is glorious.
Yeah, exactly.
So I thought...
But also the blockchain world is and many technologies, it isn't a single technology that's transforming, right? It's there are all these things emerging, and where they're converging, that's the power of the transformation. So, there is no blockchain without distributed ledger, without cloud technology, without internet, without, some AI, and all those things being able to then create oracles and interoperate with the real world and measure physical things and record them and share them on the ledger, blah, blah, blah. All of those technologies converging, those emerging technologies converging, the synergistic benefit is blockchain. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, and maybe there's a parallel there in the art world, that there's a lot of different themes that are emerging and converging that is allowing then some form of almost new revolution, which is what we're seeing.
Well, somehow this is all connected. I haven't really figured out how yet, but you can see bits and pieces of how they do come together. But take it back a little bit to the conversation where I first heard you, it was such an exceptional thing to hear someone in your position and with your background to say actual things about the traditional legacy finance system as well as the emerging one, and not in a imbalanced or like any kind of, just in the most succinct, this is true, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, and here you go. And that I found so refreshing. And I was wanting to maybe hear a little bit more about how you see, with your background and experience, the legacy system from where you come from, and where do you see this going that is going to be the most beneficial in terms of a balanced perspective towards it?
Yeah. Well, I think the sort of purpose of that talk was to try and analyse some of what I perceive the factors that have led us to where we are and what we need to do to succeed. So in financial services, what I was saying was, here are some of the key drivers behind the need for change, but here are also some of the factors that are precluding us from embracing that change. Here's sort of a revolutionary technology. Why are we not running around like headless chickens saying, hallelujah, let's do it, and doing it well? And so I was trying to explain the factors that have got us into this predicament, and why we're a little bit more conservative and slow about the transformation that is clearly needed, and what those negatives are, and how then. And the most important part is, so what do we do in a positive, constructive way to solve for it? So trying to sort of distill that succinctly now would be, there's the financial crisis, and prior to that, financial services institutions had lots and lots of technologies. They were very driven by individuals who were successful being able to pretty much do what they wanted inside a bank. You could buy this technology, you could adopt this, you could architectural data in the way that you wanted. So there was no uniform way. We were very, very decentralized beings, which on the one hand is fantastic because it allows people to move quickly. You can be very agile when you're decentralized. The problem was when the world changed and regulation happened, and rightly so, not denying the need for any of that, the fact that decentralization led to huge fragmentation meant that when you need to now be efficient in a fragmented world, efficiency is your enemy, because no data architecture is the same. No system can talk to another system very efficiently. So when you need to be super, super efficient and you've been the beneficiary of agility in a fragmented, and fragmentation is the outcome, in a very decentralized world, when you need to say, okay, we need to be super efficient now, we need to do things differently, the transformation from old to new is a challenge in of itself, so from a data and technology. But then we have to overlay that with the whole cultural transformation that's taken place. So the culture, when I started in financial services, were rainmakers. They were saying people who could buy systems, could fire people, hire people. It was all very sort of individual driven, and culture was a meritocracy. And funnily enough, talking about diversity, my team that I work with, we were having a big debate last week as to whether it's actually got better or worse for people during that sort of 30-year period if you are different from the norm. So 30 years ago, if a rainmaker saw a piece of talent, it didn't matter whether they were university educated, black, female, from Asia, from whatever. They didn't care. They just saw, here's someone who I want, who's going to make me look better, who's going to make me richer. Here's talent, right? Whereas now, that sort of homogenization of so much of the process means
there's a lot of fear, right?
And so we'll come on to fear, but even just that homogenization means that for whatever the drivers are, that you use certain functions first. That cleansing process, the validation of the CV, do they meet all these criteria? You're actually losing the creative diversity of the pool that you were seeking talent from. You're bringing it down and restricting it, so that by the time it gets to the rainmaker, you've got 4 people from a very small pool, as opposed to back in the day when the rainmaker just went out and hired whoever they wanted that they thought was talented. So there's lots of pros and cons for both. But so where we are today is pretty broken from a technology platform perspective, from an architecture perspective, from technology perspective. Then there's an overlay of regulation, and we had pretty unhealthy cultures. Those rainmaker cultures, for some of the positives, like the diversity positive of being able to just hire talent regardless. The negative today is that they created some pretty bad behaviours, right, and pretty bad conduct and ethics and values. So we definitely need to go through that cultural transformation to be more ethical, to be more strategic, more sustainable, care about the long term, not care about short term. I mean, I think one of the biggest failings in financial services is this desperate need to have quarterly positive performance. It doesn't make sense to me that if you're a business with an aspiration to survive the next 30 years, that every quarter you've got to improve your profit for shareholder, you've got to improve your financial performance, because you've got to invest in the longer term. You've got to look at your relationship with the client as a strategic, ethical, sustainable relationship, which may mean that you turn them away from you for the near term and direct them somewhere else because you're not able to satisfy their needs. But if you've got this quarterly pressure all the time that we do, that our pension funds constantly demand of financial services firms and other organisations to always improve every quarter on quarter and year on year, and comparing all these metrics, what they're measuring and what they're reporting on is not really those factors that are the sustainable, ethical factors. So I also think that we ourselves, in the way we want our pension funds and everything else, demand.
Everyone has to figure it out for themselves, and how to not completely sacrifice.
But it's not a virtuous circle, right? So it's a negative circle. So we do need to address those factors. But the cultural change that financial services institutions need to go through isn't just on their behaviours and their values through those lenses, but also looking in a much more long-term way about what matters to their clients, what matters to their staff, what matters to all their stakeholders, and partnering and being much more much more cognitive of a community and sharing, and that's not our DNA. So we have to help them. We have to help them believe all of these things are the right path forward. So your creativity point is really quite critical there. But it's about my point with something as transformative as DLT is, we can't do it big bang. Nobody trusts. People might have lost trust in financial services.
I went through the white paper phase of the last one. I lost plenty of trust in the crypto.
Also, financial services lost trust in themselves, right? So they don't trust their own ability to transform. And if we hold the theory that we believe that society needs intermediaries between the providers of capital and the users of capital. Even if you fragment that and have all the sort of disruption, bringing in lots of components, and you have things like open banking, and there's all these different layers. The reality is, my sort of belief is financial services need to exist in a much more culturally wholesome, ethical, sustainable, stakeholder partnering way.
Well, yeah.
I think it needs to exist. So therefore, how do we help them be successful to exist? And I think that's about small wins and not about big dramatic transformations, but small wins.
I think that the dramatic transformations where I see they should happen is the financial inclusion of at least I think 40% of the world's population that doesn't have any access to the banking services. I think there's a certain amount of tradition that is involved in that and lack of creativity, but then there's also maybe a little bit of holding things as they are because it's comfortable for some people as opposed to moving. And whatever you think of which part is comfortable with crypto or DLT or blockchain is that it's forcing upon the change, kind of like in a similar way as I saw when the record labels, if you think of a record label, it's essentially technology that provided the power for the record label. And then they utilized 10 years of all of their power fighting against the new technology.
Sure.
And of course, they kind of badly shot themselves in the foot in the process as opposed to being adaptive of the whole thing. So
absolutely.
Do you see it's a little bit similar?
I do, but again, I go back to my other point earlier, which is it's not one single factor though. So to see inclusivity from a financial perspective, in of itself, crypto is just one aspect. Mm-hmm. So for crypto to exist, people need handsets and channels and mediums and power and electricity or solar or something to power it all. So there's an infrastructure around it. Sure. that needs to exist also to facilitate that inclusivity. So, there are basic things like identity of that individual, so they can be identified, and so that they can safeguard their own wealth as they try and attain financial inclusivity. So, whether that's iris recognition or fingerprint recognition, but that infrastructure, if we're taking inclusivity to sort of, in a poverty sense, in a financial well-being sense, in that community, to achieve financial inclusivity, there are layers and layers of foundational infrastructure that we need to put in place. And crypto is definitely a piece of that jigsaw picture, but it's not the most important piece. It's a piece. So, power, as I said, is a piece. Identity is a piece. The handset is a piece. So all of these components of the foundation of that infrastructure to achieve financial inclusivity have to be put in place. And so whether, it's done with political support and corporate support, it isn't going to be one driver of change that's going to solve that massive jigsaw picture and all of the component pieces that need to be put in place. It's a community of different stakeholders that need to come together to solve.
I suppose this is this might be a little bit of a long point again, but just to give a little bit of background as well, is because the art world obviously is quite left in its political leanings. And I come from a family, my stepfather, who's been with me ever since I was 1 year old, he was one of the directors of the Center of Commerce for Helsinki. And he was an entrepreneur and a CEO, and I grew up in this kind of culture. And then I went to a very left-wing art school. So, but from the left point of view,
me having a conversation with you, I'm already making myself Satan, because you're not meant to be part of a certain kind of conversation. But bizarrely enough, when I entered some of the more traditional economics through crypto first, that allowed me a portal in to explore also the legacy world from a different point of view, as opposed to what artists tend to usually say. I found now, bizarrely, that the majority of the world's artists are much more uniform than the suits that they tend to themselves criticize. And the last time I had a conversation like this was with the CEO of the London Blockchain Derivative Exchange. And that guy was an absolute rock star. I mean, he was much more harsh about the financial world than I was. And
isn't it sort of, 1984 and 4 legs good and 2 legs bad, and all of those stories that go back in time where, don't you ultimately through success become what you hated if you're not careful? I think that's a sort of an age-old wisdom that we have to be wary of. That your point is that the artists when they become successful and become conformists, actually become what they try to challenge in the first place.
Quite totalitarian, actually.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's my point. So it's very Orwell.
That's my challenge too.
It's very Orwell-esque. Right?
Yeah.
Is the nature of humans.
But that maybe comes to my background in the sort of bridge building thing. And I just said the words about my stepfather. I'm now 40, and I'm old enough to be honest enough about realizing some things that, because my dad left my mom on the way to the hospital to have me to go and live with another family, or so the legend says. There's two sides of the story, I'm sure. But essentially, I realized that this sort of obsession that I have for putting things together and have a more balanced conversation in between worlds that tend to disintegrate is maybe coming from my childhood of wanting for my parents to communicate. And that was an interesting sort of psychology thing. And right now in the art school, I went a little bit more to the left, as that was the culture. Yeah. And then in the crypto space, I sort of entered listening to someone like Andreas Antonopoulos, and he's very hardcore in his one thing. But luckily also the sort of fresh right-wing arguments like Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein and the intellectual dark web is what they call it. They would come from the understanding of the infrastructure and the importance of how it evolved and why, and the responsible individual, as opposed to the kind of disparaged collective. Sure. So these are the things.
So without trying to take it into sort of an intellectual level that may become a bit sort of, patronising. I mean, essentially, there are some common factors here. If you don't listen and understand a different opinion, how can you challenge it? How can you debate it? And how can you decide to reject it? So to my mind, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about. So my parents, for example, are fairly different in their political outlooks. And I think that was really interesting growing up, because their values actually bizarrely are very similar, their underlying values, but their sort of generic politics are fairly different. One's quite left of centre, one's quite right of centre, without being right in the sort of negative right. He's so right, I think he's communist, so full circle.
Yeah, God. Horseshoe effect.
Yeah, exactly. But they listen to one another all the time, and they understand each other's perspectives, and therefore they're able to have a much more quality debate. And through osmosis, I grew up in that environment of listening and understanding. And so when I have an opinion, it's not based on this sort of totalitarian or autocratic right, or this sort of state view that I am so validated in my opinion, I'm better than you, that I trust my opinion only. It's so whatever we want to. I'm trying to simplify all that rather than get into sort of the intellectual language behind it.
Sure,
but I think that's really
to maybe bring it home, I realized that there was a rather than kind of go deep into my psychology, the point was that with Jordan Peterson, one of the things that, because he's very well versed in all the totalitarian regimes that came about, and what he sort of tends to say is that when the left and right fail to talk to one another, when talking fails, violence or just disintegration are the only options. And that's kind of what it feels like with society right now, that's the direction as to where we're going. The further we polarize, and it just seems that violence is just around the corner.
We're going to look at Hong Kong for that. So.
Right. So here's bringing it back to, I suppose, the whole theme of the conversation is that one of the things when I made that money documentary 10 years ago, one of the things that I realized that unless if this is fixed, this is just we're just treating the symptoms, we're not treating the disease.
Yeah, sure.
And the monetary system is at a kind of cracking point. And it's kind of scary to have conversations with people who really understand it, who are behind the scenes, who say that what might or might not happen with the next recession or the next bubble bursting. So would you have a take on that? But I suppose this is a mess of a question. I apologize, but maybe you get the general gist of it.
Yeah, so, well, I think we debated it a little bit, actually. I think that's where the debate got quite heated in that talk that I gave. And my view was, those that have build walls to protect, right? So whether you're talking about financial institutions or central governments, they're acting in a very protective, defensive nature because of their views on their roles as protectors of their people, whatever that may be, whether it's political nation and state, or whether it's of CEOs of corporates and financial services firms. As opposed to a generation that is emerging, that is grown up in a different view of society, where they feel a bit betrayed by society. They certainly in England, that our young people are going to leave university with debts. They didn't get the grants that my generation got. They got debts. They aren't just going to walk into jobs. It is a much bigger pool of talent to be selected from. So, the number of jobs and the quality of those roles and who's available for them, and are they being taught the skills that matter in the future? And, the whole sort of financial austerity challenges of the English economy at the moment. It's a different world. They've also grown up in a world where digitally they've been able to see an awful lot more. It's in the palm of their hands, as I said earlier. So, I didn't know what I didn't have because it wasn't even transparent to me in any way, shape or form. They only have to turn the TV on and they're going to see what life is like if they were, in different circumstances, financially and otherwise. And good and bad, by the way. So they don't just see the good, they see, how lucky they are, but nevertheless it's all relative. And they've grown up in an era where they don't trust the big institutions. They don't trust the central authorities. There's much more honesty in some ways. Although I think investigative journalism is less than it should be now. But anyway, that's because of financial backers and everything else. But that's a different conversation. But nevertheless, people, kids are much more able to see real examples of the betrayal of those that ought not to have betrayed them. And I think, therefore, that trust and that breakdown and that technology, as those converge over this generation, I definitely think there will be, to the sort of core point, a decentralization again. I mean, it's just inevitable, I think.
We're at a cusp of a new world, but none of us really know what it's going to be.
Well, I'm 51 years old, so, how can I possibly say that I think and feel and understand the pressures of a generation that is, 30 years after me? The children that are 20 today, my kids and their friends, are leaving, their tertiary educations with, lots and lots of debt. They're struggling to get work. They're never going to be able to afford their first home the way that my generation could. They don't trust what they see around them. They have a lot of fear. I mean, they have huge opportunities as well, but I didn't have all the pressures of, this
climate change. The planet's dying.
The planet itself, and Instagram and WhatsApp, and there's just so much more pressure on them, and mental health challenges. And I think
maybe it's always been like this. I mean, in the 80s, you had the or 60s, but the planet was blowing up because of our nukes, and then it was the Second World War. It was an 18-year-old boy.
Baby boomer, right? So I grew up in a generation where the images on the television were really, because that was our only stimuli. So everybody watched the same programs, and we all debated the same thing the next day in school or work, and they were pretty scary images, back in the day.
But it also kind of kept society together because most people were having the same conversation. All of this diversity that we right now have is that it's taking people in such different paths that it's hard to sometimes find common ground. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of try and strip things a bit more back to basic, really. And, my view is that people need to be... Look, I'm not a religious person. I wish I were. I think there's a great thing in being able to have faith, right? I don't have faith, so I'm not religious. I can't believe in something I don't understand or see or can feel or touch. But the moral conduct of many religions, if you strip it back to the moral basis of, respecting and listening and trying to understand and trying to be considerate and trying to think more strategically and trying to be more sustainable in your outlook, which means that we would care more about the environment and we would care more about our neighbours and we wouldn't close our minds to the terrible things that are going on in most of the world today, would make for a better world regardless. And those are pretty basic things, right? So I'm not sure that financial services is one component, be it crypto or the banks, of all the demons. There are demons there for sure, but they're also agents for change for the positive.
Right. No, it tends to be like maybe the part of my frustration with all of this is how people quite often, and I don't find, because I used to study religion and different kinds of spiritual things, and I even did some psychedelic journeys or whatever, and those tend to take it from the belief into the experience realm, and that helps a little bit. And it's a shame in so many ways that some of those are banned, but essentially if you have some sort of a spiritual background on things, some sort of a grounding, then it used to be that I looked at the religious dogma people as in those to stay away from because they were a little too weird. And when I went to church when I was a kid, I just felt like there's something important here, but you're not doing this right. And I kind of went away from it. I sort of agree
with you. I mean, I think any extreme, any fanaticism is unhealthy, whether it's religious or even in our celebrity culture. I mean, I can appreciate and some great tennis player or footballer or golfer's skills for being an incredible, sports person. I can do the same with dancers, and people are very gifted and work very hard at developing that gift, whether it's singing or whatever. But I don't put them on a pedestal and say you're a better human being than I am, better member of society. And if there's only one loaf of bread and 1 pint of water left, it should be you because of your more value potentially than I am. Yeah. And I certainly don't believe in the celebrity culture just because, this sort of desire for fame, and I find all of that, beyond repulsive, to be honest. But but if you strip all of that back and say, what really matters so fanaticism for me is something I passionately reject and hero worship. But if you strip it back to what really matters, your fundamental value system, then I think in religion, and many religions, and there was a great exhibition at the Dome in 1999, 2000, when we sort of had the end of the millennium and the new millennium and all that good stuff, the year Y2K, where they did a sort of a unification, all the common themes of the world's top 20 religions or whatever it was. And it was an incredible exhibition because it identified the common traits of all of our key religions, rather than the differences. And he went around this sort of part of the Millennium Dome and went, wow, they all say this, they all say this. And literally, whether it was Judaism or the Shiites or the Sunnis or Christianity or some form of baptism and Protestants and Catholics, there's so many different variations on the theme. But when you distilled it down as they did,
quite similar.
It was really similar. And that moral code, which was really what they were trying to identify there, even if they have multiple or single deities, the moral code, the fundamentals were pretty
universals.
Yeah, pretty universal.
That was the whole foundation of the 2 years of work that I did with the Veena Malik project. Right. But even though she was Pakistani and Muslim, the whole theme of it was all world religion coming together, what was unified and common about them.
Yeah.
Bizarrely, though, I found that the media was mostly interested in the controversy part, and they
Sure,
sort of
because-
looked into it to the point when they realized, oh, we can't make this into a bad thing.
Yeah.
But they didn't actually go towards finding what was the gist of the project.
Because it's not exciting, right? So it's not newsworthy. So, we always report the negative rather than the positive. It's just, of all the things that happened yesterday, they want to report a disaster in Bermuda, which of course we need to be aware of. But, the disaster in Hong Kong that's taking place, we're sort of looking at, and Syria we're looking at, but we're not actually doing very much about it. So we'd much rather cover the negatives in superficiality than address things that we could do positively.
That was maybe the previous thing. What I was trying to say is that in the absence of religion, almost everything has become a religion. So it's, whereas it used to be sort of priestly, dogmatic class, maybe in football or so, but I don't ever remember it being this sort of tense with people's opinions of how tribal we are in certain kinds of ways.
Polarized. I mean, the world is in a really bizarre place. I don't know in my life if it's been as polarized, whether it's, popularism or lots of other challenges that are evolving in our societies that are causing all this friction and faction, and but then you look at the power of the one, and I've forgotten the young girl's name, but there's that amazing schoolgirl who has just got off her boat after 3 weeks to get to the States to carry on her mission for bringing attention to the damage that climate change is. The power of one can still happen, right? That young girl that said that she wasn't going to go to school on a Friday afternoon, and encouraged lots of students to challenge what's being ignored. I mean, that's incredible, and I think that's always the sort of the I guess the golden nugget, the opportunity, is that there is always the opportunity for the power of one to create a ripple so great that it will allow us to change for the positive.
Well, that was very much the point. And that was my very first keynote that I gave as well, is that I started following this one genius kid called Boy in Slat. And he came up with this whole theme of the Ocean Cleanup Project, which is this device that allows the ocean wave power to clean all the plastic out. And with climate change, it's a little bit more intangible, and it's a little bit more slower, and there's so much politics involved in that now that it's a little complicated. But one thing that I really wanted to bring to the blockchain space is that now that you're saying that all of these things are disintegrating, we have international problems, and many people think that blockchain is this intangible, ununderstandable thing. Why don't you take some of your marketing money, go and clean up a place full of plastic, slap your logo in that, and say, this is what we did, and this is what the kind of values that we stand for. Because if it is decentralized, if it is international, make it relevant to people's lives, make it tangible.
Sure.
And I'd love to see more of that kind of thing.
So
Screw your Lambos.
How do you take something out of the sort of dark side and bring it into the light is by using it for good.
Yeah.
And at the moment, unfortunately, particularly in the crypto world, it's not, one of the sort of easiest daggers to throw at crypto is, it's not in the light. So, the very nature of the decentralized technology and protocols means, you don't really know who's behind things. The secrecy and the lack of transparency are core values of that decentralization, but they're also things that allow those that want to challenge to see it as a negative. So use the very nature of the core principles of the technology for good, and use the technology as an agent for change for good. And then yes, it is decentralizing. Yes, there is lack of transparency, but that shouldn't counterbalance to such an extreme the sort of potential of that technology. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. We need to sort of amass use cases for good, and there are several. I mean, I know people are doing things with sort of efficacy of mining and being able to identify blood diamonds or avoid that the diamonds being sourced in an unethical way, using DLT and blockchain technology. So there are lots of wholesome in the light use cases. And I
but
think
the human corruption always prevails, no matter what the technology.
But if we're evangelists, which is, I guess, our generation of blockchain users are evangelists. Like, we're trying to evangelize the use of this technology. We're trying to demystify the myths. We're trying to show the power of how this technology can simplify our worlds and bring good to our world.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that's from a cryptocurrency perspective or a use case perspective about transparency in the supply of materials, and that the fabric wasn't dyed using poisons that are going into a river and causing terrible diseases for young women in India, or that the egg was properly organically farmed, and that those use cases for good matter, and we should be, as evangelists, embracing those and giving airtime and trying to get coverage from journalists for good, because that technology has got a use case of crypto and it's financial. It's lost itself in it's an alternative monetary system, rather than actually these are the things that matter. These are the principles behind this alternative monetary system that are good, and we should be using them for good. And there are principles behind this technology which are wholly capable of huge transformation in things like mining and sourcing and the vertical supply chain that would bring huge amounts of good to society. So, it's up to us as the evangelizers to give light to those use cases as well.
And sort of, because one thing about the shakeup is that on just multiple levels, it just feels like we're asleep at the wheel in so many different kinds of ways. And to bring it back to maybe, as opposed to the creative aspect of things, is that I just saw this one viral video about the new hurricane Florian, and there was just this frustrated.
Dorian, I think. Was it Dorian yesterday?
Or Dorian?
Maybe Florian. I don't know. Whatever the one yesterday was.
So there was just a frustrated Florida guy who was just like starting to just say that, why can't we figure out on how to prevent these things? We could be just sending the Navy or the Air Force. We could dismantle, put some ice in the where it's getting heat up. Why do we just suffer this time and time again in the simultaneous sort of cycle? And I think that's it is that asleep at the wheel type of thing of what we have. And one of the things that I see in crypto as well is that there's a lot of ideology and a lot of, we'll do this. And then this guy or lady gets very, very rich, and all of a sudden all these good ideals of whatever they wanted to do, the contribution has say waned a little bit in terms of the enthusiasm.
Hasn't the sort of pig become the human there in that analogy? Those that were the libertarians, non-conformists, and all the principles and values that they had when they became super, super rich. I'm not sure they're any better than those people that they were challenging in the first place.
The idealism, I suppose, at this point, I've had enough encounters with human beings altogether that idealism doesn't have too much of a place anymore in the experience, because I can't take the pain anymore, to be honest.
Let's not go into a negative cycle.
No, not at all. But in terms of getting stuff done in the optimal way, trying to see what is still dreamy but realistic, so you actually get something done, as opposed to what is perhaps for an artist is easily someone who takes the feet off the ground, not grounded, and fantasizes great worlds, but they never actually manifest outside of anything other than a painting. And I think that's a waste. Type of situation.
I completely agree. And I think, going back to my point about if you're 20 or 25 today or younger, we're leaving a broken financial architecture for them and not a very nice environmental legacy, and certainly not perhaps the safer world. I don't think my generation have improved those things, let's put it like that. So there is a role for challengers, be it technology challengers and those who think differently, to try and counterbalance some of that, for sure. But it goes back to my earlier point. We've got to use these technologies and opportunities and platforms for some good use cases, not just for self-enrichment financially or otherwise.
Sure. For balance, I suppose. We're, I suppose, coming close to wrapping this up. If you're comfortable, I'd just like to maybe say something that is quite inspiring, just to plug. I've got not a cent writing on this, but as a thought maybe that encapsulates a lot of the things of what you said as well. And I've never heard it so succinctly and beautifully put as this guy called Eric Weinstein put it. He started a podcast called The Portal. And the idea of it is beautiful, because in some sense we go through these heroes' journeys or portals through life. Some fall into the rabbit hole of crypto, or some do whatever spiritual experience. All of a sudden you meditated and a whole new world opened up. But the way that he sums up the sort of caricature of conversation today into something that was very tangible is this example of, he said that we have had a stagnation of development since the 70s in multitudes of areas that we built. If you look at it as the Star Trek Enterprise, the ship, we built the central computer. We have Google, we have the Macintosh, we have the screens, but we didn't do much of molecular or sort of biochemists or physics or energy. Most importantly, we haven't evolved in our energy production at all, our financial systems. The majority of the actual ship and its function has not been built since the 70s, and it's been experiencing this sort of degeneration. And this is part of the big problem, that engineering, all of these kinds of key things have left from the West especially, and that is the track we should be getting on to.
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, which is, everything's a jigsaw picture. Yeah. we just focus on one piece of the jigsaw. We've forgotten 27 other pieces.
Right.
And whether that's in that context or many others, there are 27 other pieces that need to also be improved and refreshed and rethought and done differently and done better and done more inclusively.
That's a last question. Last question for you. What's your major challenge and where are you going next? Where do you get your excitement, and what's your?
Well, I think I hit on it a bit earlier, really. I mean, I guess for me, I do believe that there's a role for trusted intermediaries between those that have capital and those that need it, and so I'd like to see that role executed in a ethical and sustainable way. Those institutions will need to evolve, and for me, the technologies that are around that could support that transformation from the old world to the new need to be embraced. But there are so many pieces of that jigsaw that need to be re-engineered and rethought and addressed. And so, my sort of, I guess if you like, personal legacy that I would like to achieve is as an evangelist for that transformation, dispelling the myths about adopting those different technologies, doing things in a sustainable, ethical way. Being honest and transparent shouldn't be a negative to behaviour at the top of the shop, and being diverse and inclusive shouldn't be politically correct nonsense, but something that actually people see the true stakeholder value, financial and other benefits from that. So where I am today and what I want to do is be a bit of an evangelist, that you can be able to be an agent for change for good without compromising your core values that I believe to be necessary to be wholesome and humane, and that's really what I'm trying to do. Right. Whether it's technology in of itself or the D&I, those are why I've chosen those two playgrounds in financial services, because that's how I believe that it can be achieved. But a lot of it is, educating and dispelling myths and sharing and listening and debating and helping understand, listening to people's fears, and which is often what they are, and then dispelling those myths. Right.
There's a very wholesome sort of value system underneath it all, and then you have to negotiate with the world as to how you're going to get there. From my point of view, first of all, it speaks volumes of you that you would have this conversation with me. coming from your background, and there was at one point on Facebook there was this picture that was circulating, and I kind of chuckled a bit when I saw it for the first time, because it said that beware of artists, because they're the most dangerous ones, because they have all sorts of conversations with all sorts of people from side to side. And I suppose that's what makes creativity so fun, that there is an element of danger in it.
Sure.
And thank you for giving me this opportunity to have this
My
chat
pleasure.
with you.
Been interesting.
So let's see how people respond to it, and I hope it's helpful to people. Because it's been such a revelation to understand just how caricature-like people are seen in different kinds of groups, and coming into this world has really opened my eyes in many ways. I try and help the conversation along as best I can. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We're on the lookout for guests, sponsors, and opportunities to expand. You'll find Vesa's works on artforcrypto.com, and also check out his writings on newsb2c.com.